Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today.
From stem cells to mapping the brain and medical ethics, we hope to give you a glimpse of the bright future ahead through discussions with some of the people making it happen. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. You might have noticed this is one of the first episodes we've put out since the summer. I've recently moved to Boston to start a research job, working actually in the lab of one of our first guests, Doug Melton. So I took a sort of brief hiatus to basically set myself up over here. The good news is that being based in Boston will open up a new pool of people for us to speak to. So with that out of the way, this week's episode is all about coffee and its various effects on human health. Our guest is Dr. Rob Van Dam, a professor in the University of Singapore's School of Public Health, as well as an adjunct professor in Harvard School of Public Health. Now, Rob's primary interest is in the role that diet plays in causing obesity and type 2 diabetes. He's been actively involved in researching how the chemicals in coffee affect the risk for these diseases. And he's recently published a really fantastic review article on coffee and health in the New England Journal of Medicine. All of this really makes Rob the perfect person to talk to about this topic. And we talk about caffeine as well as the various other phytochemicals in coffee. And we approach human health from a whole host of perspectives. Starting with the epidemiological data on its relationship with chronic diseases, as well as its effects on our sleeping patterns, the microbiome, and fibrosis, to name a few things. So without further ado, we really hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, here we are. Rob, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Stanley, it's a great pleasure.
I was thinking maybe we could kick off by you just giving us a background on sort of your interests, your areas of research, and how you've come to think about sort of coffee and health.
Yeah, my background is really in nutrition research, and then I specialized in epidemiology, particularly the epidemiology of type 2 diabetes. And when I started that about 20 years ago, that was quite wide open. Not many people had looked at the role of diet in the etiology of diabetes, in the development of diabetes. And at some point, one of the things I got interested in was coffee. And the reason was that I started to realize that coffee was much more than just caffeine, but actually a substantial source of phytochemicals like polyphenols, some minerals, even some vitamins. And because people drink it quite regularly throughout the day, it can really add up to people's contribution of these type of substances in the diet. So that made me think a bit more deeply about the health effects that coffee could have, and that's why we looked at coffee and diabetes. And then quite surprisingly, we found that coffee was associated with a lower risk of diabetes, which first few people believed, but then it was confirmed in many studies across the world, several dozen studies now. And I think that opened up our thinking a bit more about coffee as a potential health hazard that was to be avoided because of the detrimental effects of high caffeine intake and perhaps other substances in coffee, to also thinking about potential beneficial effects of coffee. And I think now we're much further with the work of many people across the world. There's a much more balanced view of both potential detrimental effects and potential beneficial effects of coffee on health. So I've not only been studying coffee, also a lot of other aspects of coffee, of the diet, but somehow I haven't really been able to escape the coffee
Sort of draws you
area
back in.
completely.
Like me every morning, sort of.
Sure, I think people keep fascinating about their daily coffee habit and what impact it could have on them. So it remains intriguing.
A ritual that all of us have in common. That's very interesting. So throughout your sort of career thinking about nutrition and diabetes, the field you've been thinking about has changed completely. So you're really no stranger to being in the midst of a very rapidly evolving field.
Yeah, I think the intriguing part is not only about coffee, but in general in nutrition, that there's been a lot of focus, and there still is, just simply about macronutrients, high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat. Whereas there's thousands of different chemicals and other aspects of the diet that could be relevant for health. And coffee kind of illustrates that there's much more to a supposedly simple drink like coffee than you would first think.
And I suspect, just to follow on from that, we're going to bounce around a bit thinking about first caffeine and then coffee as a whole. So just to be clear, obviously caffeine is the thing that springs to mind when you think of coffee, but like you said, there are quite literally hundreds of other chemicals in coffee which could all be having effects on our health. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit about polyphenols and caffeine, and all of that. I think a good place to get started would be to sort of think about, perhaps it'd be best to start with epidemiology, because I think that is such an interesting story about how our understanding of coffee and health has evolved so much over time. And it sort of speaks to the point about how our understanding of nutrition and health is constantly evolving. I think back in the 90s, even the WHO added caffeine to its list of, carcinogens. And now our understanding of, for example, cancer risk and coffee or caffeine intake, I'm using the two interchangeably when I probably shouldn't, has changed completely. So, sort of, what's the rundown on the epidemiology of coffee and chronic disease?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. So uh, I think around the start of the 1980s, there was a big concern about the impact of coffee on cancer risk, for example, pancreatic cancer. There were several studies being published that showed a clear association between coffee consumption and cancer risk. At the same time, there was also concern about the effect of coffee and particularly caffeine on cardiovascular health, impact on heart attacks and stroke. So
Mm,
what happened over time is that uh, when the study designs became better, so instead of kind of retrospective case control studies where cases of disease and controls try to recall their past consumption habits, and then they compare these cases and controls, um, yeah, that seemed to have been quite prone to bias. When later the
mm,
better studies that were conducted where people asked about their coffee consumption and a range of other habits before they actually developed disease, so-called prospective cohort studies, then these associations didn't really hold. So that part of it is kind of selection bias. So you need the appropriate controls that are really comparable, rather than, for example, people with gastrointestinal disorders or that have reduced their coffee consumption because they have that condition. So you need controls from the general population that are comparable. And another thing is the control for other lifestyle habits. So it's very common across the world that people who smoke more also drink more coffee. So, of course, if you don't properly control for the smoking habit, you attribute all kinds of detrimental health effects, ranging from cancer to cardiovascular disease, to the coffee, while it's actually the smoking habit that often comes with the coffee drinking, the heavy coffee drinking, that's responsible. So, once the better studies were conducted in terms of study design and control for other lifestyle habits like smoking, a lot of these concerns were actually not confirmed. So the studies actually show there was no association with cancer outcomes or with cardiovascular risk. Yeah,
mm. It's sort of, if you think about it, it's almost it sounds like the archetypal mistakes that one can make when doing population studies. And you can definitely see how the effect of smoking would be strong enough to, you know, draw this
yeah,
correlation between coffee consumption and cancer
yeah.
risk and all this other stuff.
What may be nice to talk about a little bit is just a whole spectrum of health conditions and diseases that may be related to coffee and caffeine. So, and it could kind of be split up by in kind of acute effects on, for example, nervousness or sleep, or positive effects like alertness, and more long-term effects, what you already alluded to a little bit, like cancers, heart disease, Parkinson's disease, liver conditions. So perhaps we can start with the acute effects.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, why a lot of people drink coffee or caffeine is, of course, because it gives a bit of a boost and it increases alertness, it decreases sleepiness. And that's not just anecdotal, but there's quite a bit of good evidence that it helps people to stay alert and to increase, for example, their reaction time, to increase their vigilance. Um, So, for example, if people have long drives or they do work in the military, it does help if they use caffeine to stay alert and to to become less sleepy, basically.
Mm.
Of course, there's some end to it. You can't compensate for a complete lack of sleep by drinking lots of
By
caffeine, but
drinking lots of caffeine.
it does help people a little bit, particularly with very monotonous work, to stay concentrated. The other side of that coin is, of course, that caffeine can also make it difficult for people to fall asleep, and that can be an issue. And yeah, but what is quite fascinating is how much it seems to differ from individual to individual. How much that is an issue. You already said, oh, some
Mm.
people after their dinner, sometimes 9 o'clock in the evening, they have caffeine and they don't have apparently any difficulties falling asleep. Whereas other people after 3, 4 p.m., they say, well, I'll stay off the caffeine, otherwise I can't sleep.
Well, I think
And
this is really worth contextualizing in the context of our sleep environment. When you think, like, we live in a world now where I think on average people get 6 hours and some minutes of sleep a night. There's a serious problem with sleep deficiency in our society, and so thinking about what negative effects caffeine might have on that sleep latency, the time between going to bed and being able to fall asleep in some people, might be really worth understanding what the effects are. And kind of as we've alluded to, it seems like the way that caffeine is metabolized within our bodies, by enzymes in the liver, the rate at which that happens really varies within the population.
mm,
And so, sort of, okay, for example, on the tail of people who metabolize it perhaps the most slowly, or perhaps the most caffeine sensitive, how much of an alert inducing effect can caffeine have for however many hours after you drink it? If the half life is maybe, I don't know, you tell me, 6 hours.
yeah, so for some people, it's only about 2.5 hours, the half life, and then it can vary to up to 5 hours. But there's other health conditions, or other, not really health conditions, other conditions where it can be much longer. So, for example, women in the last trimester, they can have a half life of 15 hours. So that means that you drink coffee in the morning and it may be difficult falling asleep at night. So another thing is if people smoke it, you kind of have double the speed of metabolism. So and half the half life than if you're not a smoker. And oral contraceptive use can greatly lengthen the half life of caffeine. So people may see that if they go through life, that their sensitivity to caffeine may actually change quite a bit. And it seems there's not a very strong tolerance that develops towards the effect of caffeine on sleep. So
Mm.
you're right, it's a real effect, and some people should be cautious. And the interesting thing is that it seems that people do adapt to that. So I did with a whole group of colleagues, we looked at genetic variants that predicted caffeine intake. And then we noticed there are actually specific genetic variants, for example, in CYP1A2, caffeine metabolizing gene in the liver. If people have that variant, they actually metabolize caffeine more slowly, and they also have a lower caffeine intake. So it seems that people, notice how fast they metabolize caffeine based on the side effects, and then adjust for that and adapt basically to their genetic propensity to metabolize caffeine more slowly. So it seems that people are quite sensible that over the years they adapt to their caffeine metabolizing ability. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you spent enough time amongst undergraduates preparing for exams recently. I know plenty of people who aren't
That's
very
a while
reasonable.
ago, Stan. Yeah.
um, I mean, just anecdotally, it's interesting to think about smoking increasing the speed of metabolism, and like you said earlier, with respect to those population studies, smokers drinking more caffeine. Yeah.
Yeah, so at
Um,
first I thought it was just like a clustering of unhealthy habits, people drinking lots of coffee, smoking more, drinking more alcohol. But I realized it also has a biological background that you can simply drink more caffeine or you have to drink more caffeine to have the same effect on alertness if you're a smoker as compared with a non-smoker. Yeah.
and is the stimulant effect of metabolites of caffeine, for example, I think the primary one is paraxanthine.
Hmm.
Are those significant in terms of their ability to antagonize adenosine receptors? So I suppose, if they were, perhaps we shouldn't just be worried about the half-life of caffeine, but also the half-life of its metabolites.
No, that is true. So paraxanthine also has physiological effects. Yeah, so you're right. It's a bit more complex. So even if you metabolize it, and the question is what happens with the paraxanthine. I don't think it has the same effect on alertness, but it may have other physiological effects. Yeah.
Okay. You seem to be convinced that on the whole, though, people are quite reasonable about self-regulating sort of how much caffeine they drink and when, in terms of how it affects them physiologically.
I think as a whole, well, perhaps undergraduates haven't developed a complete habit yet, but
Perhaps there's some outliers.
yeah, if you drink coffee for decades throughout your life, I think you adapt a bit to your lifestyle and what works for you in terms of coffee consumption habits. But there are, of course, specific transitions where it may be quite tricky. For example, there's quite a bit of evidence that drinking a lot of coffee during pregnancy may have quite detrimental effects on the development and the growth of the fetus, and may even lead to pregnancy loss. So that's not completely conclusive evidence, but there's quite some consistent evidence from epidemiological studies that there's this effect on the growth of the fetus. So if one goes from yeah,
I mean,
if you become pregnant, that may be, for example, a time in your life to think consciously about the coffee consumption habits and cut down on the habit for that period of life.
and I think we're now straying into thinking about the more long-term effects of caffeine in coffee. So perhaps we should dive into the other aspects of that we haven't yet discussed.
Sure. So yeah, so we talked a bit about pregnancy. So I think that's an area of concern, and that's the evidence is getting stronger on that being detrimental. On the other hand, there have been some really emerging consistent evidence for benefits of caffeine and coffee on chronic diseases. Um, One of the things that has been quite pronounced and consistent is the effect of caffeine on Parkinson's disease. So higher caffeine consumption is actually associated with a lower risk of Parkinson's disease. And that seems to be the caffeine rather than the coffee. So it's, for example, if you drink decaffeinated coffee on a regular basis, that doesn't seem to be associated with one's risk of Parkinson's disease.
Now, thinking about that, to hone in on one aspect of this, which might be relevant, neurons which have adenosine receptors, at least to some extent, I know, inhibit dopaminergic neurons.
Correct. Yeah.
So if we think about this circuitry, if we inhibit the inhibition, we almost have a double minus. Perhaps the mechanism is that you are just letting these dopaminergic neurons, which are affected in Parkinson's, fire more. Or is that an oversimplification of what you think the relationship is? So what might actually be going on there? What do you think?
Well, I think that there is quite a bit of evidence that it does affect dopaminergic neurotoxic effects, so that it does go to that, at least to related pathways, and in that way, slows the neurodegeneration through the stopping these adenosine receptors or blocking the adenosine receptors. So I think that is a related pathway. So that's quite plausible, also based on animal experiments. So it seems to be one of the outcomes for which the evidence, both mechanistically, based on animal experiments, and epidemiologically, is quite consistent.
How interesting. Yeah. I mean, perhaps there are other things going on there as well we're unaware of, but at least that seems like quite a direct mechanism. And I'm sure you'll agree, as someone who thinks about populations, we're all, unfortunately, all of us who are here, we're only getting older. So thinking about neurodegeneration and decreasing risk is sort of in everyone's best interest.
Sure.
And I suppose it speaks to another aspect of coffee. Why do we, you got interested in it through thinking about diabetes. Why should any of us really care? And I suppose the answer is that it must be hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of people drink coffee. So even a 1% risk change in the risk of any given disease could have a huge impact on human health at large.
No, that's true. That's true. So, I mean, for diabetes, of course, a very major risk factor is adiposity, obesity. But what we've seen is that the effect is kind of multiplicative, so that uh, you have about a 40% reduction in risk for people drinking more than 4 or 5 cups of coffee per day as compared with non-consumption. So that's the same for obese people as for non-obese people, for leaner people. So then the absolute risk reduction is actually quite substantial for people with obesity. So of course, I think if we're talking about diet, uh, it's good to take a holistic view. So I think nobody is arguing that people should just have an unhealthy diet and lifestyle and not exercise, and then coffee will
And
save
then
them.
recover it with coffee, yeah.
I think it's just one component that could play a role as kind of a prudent beverage choice among many other aspects of the diet and lifestyle. But I think the other side of it has been that, when I went to the US in the 1990s, people were kind of frowning on my coffee consumption habits or other people's coffee consumption habits, saying, well, that's really something you shouldn't do for your health. Huh? Now it has become quite apparent that if you're worrying about your health and you want to make steps to improve your health, coffee is not really something to be worried about. It's better to put your focus and your effort on changing other habits like smoking or your lack of physical activity or whole grain intake rather than trying to reduce coffee consumption. And there may even be some benefits. Yeah.
I think it's a great point because, at this stage we can't say whether there might be some small effects that coffee has in a negative sense on the risk of some diseases, but putting it in the context of making decisions about health and what to focus on, we might really be splitting hairs at that point, and it's better to focus on things we know have a huge effect, like exercise. I want to pivot back to thinking a bit about diabetes because I know this is obviously a big area of interest for you. Um, I'd be interested to hear more about sort of. So you said there's a risk reduction which is equal in lean people and obese people, but because the risk is presumably higher for people with obesity, the absolute reduction in risk when you consume coffee is much greater. Do you think the main mechanism for this is that caffeine is sort of lipolytic, or do you think it's the effects of other compounds in coffee?
First, we did studies in Europe, so very few people were drinking decaffeinated coffee. But when we started looking at populations where decaffeinated coffee was also quite common, like the US, the effect estimates, so the risk reduction that we observed for decaffeinated coffee per cup was almost exactly the same as for caffeinated coffee. So that suggests that it's not really the caffeine in the coffee, but rather some of the other components that may be beneficial for glucose metabolism and may perhaps add to the reduction in risk of diabetes. So that's actually a very different kind of story as for Parkinson's disease, which really seems to be centered around caffeine. For diabetes, it really points at other components of coffee that have a major effect. It could be that caffeine has a little bit of an additional effect, but it doesn't seem to be the main player.
The main
Uh,
player.
and if you think about other components of coffee, there's quite a variety of candidates. One thing that's really common in coffee are the polyphenols. So there's been quite a long interest in flavonoids and other polyphenols. Um, but generally, people have been focusing more on tea and cacao, chocolate. But a certain type of polyphenols, the phenolic acids, are actually very common in coffee, and coffee is the major source. Um,
And I
other
think
other
we're very
com-
close to that fantastic sort of, it's become a buzzword now. But just to make the point clear, polyphenols are antioxidants, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, they're
Mm.
antioxidants, and there's also more specific effects on glucose metabolism. But yeah, that seems to be an important candidate. There's some other
Mm.
components like trigonelin, which is it can be a precursor of vitamin B3. There's some minerals like magnesium and potassium. There's other phenolic compounds like lignans.
Mm.
But yeah, so it could be a whole package, or it could be one of these components that benefits glucose metabolism.
Mm.
And I would
Sorry.
say that as compared with Parkinson's disease, the mechanistic research is really still a bit behind. Uh, but there seems to be enough epidemiological evidence now that's consistent enough to warrant more experimental studies to figure that out.
And like you described, there seems to be an effect on glucose metabolism. If you were thinking about coffee within the context of dietary interventions for type 2 diabetics,
Hmm.
do you
Yeah.
think it would make sense to drink coffee before exercising, after exercising? I wonder if there are ways to almost potentiate the effects you can see by timing it with other things that affect metabolism.
Yeah. Well, I'm not aware of much research on that. I think that's kind of a two different, completely different communities of researchers. One on the
Mm,
exercise front and uh, exercise performance, and the other on more like glucose metabolism and disease risk. But
mm,
that's a good point. But I think, to be fair, most of the evidence on the benefits of potential benefits of coffee on diabetes have been in the prevention of diabetes. So you really
mm,
don't have evidence that it may be beneficial for people already having diabetes. There's
mm.
some evidence that it may be particularly beneficial to have coffee after a meal to kind of slow down the glucose response to the meal. But yeah, the exercise is an excellent idea. I think that could also be a pathway for further research. Well, um, yeah, one thing we looked at is the lignans in coffee, and that uh, is metabolized by the gut bacteria and made into enteral lignans that can also have important metabolic effect and phytoestrogen effect in the body. So we saw that these circulating enterolignans that you can measure in blood were actually predictive of a lower risk of diabetes. So we're not sure that's really the actual enterolignans, but it does point at a potential result, potential effect on the gut microbiota. And there have been some studies now that drinking more coffee may be beneficial for the type of gut microbiota uh, that is present. So that's another pathway that would be very fruitful for further investigation.
I'm sure we'll come back to thinking about sort of the phytochemicals in coffee because I also want to talk a bit about Cafestol, if I'm pronouncing that
Sure.
correctly,
Yeah.
filtered and unfiltered coffee. But before we get there, there's two other things I'd like to talk about. The first is sort of being sucked into this world of coffee. Has it brought you into contact with any of kind of the history of well, coffee and I suppose caffeine more broadly? Where's this drink that's taken over the world come from? Can we read about people throughout history either singing its praises or decrying its negative effects on them?
Yeah, that's actually a very fascinating story. So coffee has been the first evidence of coffee being drunk is from the around the 15th century, early 15th century in Yemen, and they actually drank coffee like we drink it, with the grinded beans and hot water, and then it has spread to other parts of the world. First, the Middle East, uh, parts of Asia, like Turkey and the south of India,
Mm,
as well as eventually to Europe, to Malta, to Venice, where the coffee houses started. And quite rapidly, it started then in the 16th century with many coffee houses in the UK and other parts of Europe. Um, yeah, spreading throughout the world. And yeah, the impact that has had over time has been quite fascinating. So it has been ranging from being designated as the devil's drink by the Catholic Church, and then later the Pope drank it apparently, and he approved of the beverage, uh, and also aspects of coffee that the whole culture around it, the coffee houses, hundreds of coffee houses throughout Europe, and coffee became kind of a
a
way to
great
connect.
facilitator, almost.
Yeah, yeah, the facilitator of discussions, to the extent that it almost became controversial in countries like the UK, in England, where uh, it became kind of a source of political unrest during the Enlightenment. That in these coffee
Mm.
houses, a lot of political and philosophical discussions led to more conscious populace. Another,
Do we know of any Enlightenment figures who wrote explicitly about it?
I'm not aware of that. Yeah, that
Okay.
may be true. It would be fascinating, but I'm not so. I did see something about. John Adams in the US, that at some point they had the Boston Tea Party, and they dismissed of tea as not a patriotic drink anymore after
Hmm.
they had the tea party, and then they switched over to coffee and thought it would be a more appropriate drink. So there's a lot of different stories over time, but I'm not a complete expert on the history of coffee. And also, of
Mm.
course, in terms of trade, it has been an important source of income for many countries, like in southern South America. Uh, the Dutch, the VOC, the East Indian Company, they started growing coffee in Java, and that has spread across the world. So it has played a big economic role over time as well.
Do you see a difference in the sort of the coffee beans from different parts of the world, and the phytochemical profile of these beans?
Well, yeah, the two main type of coffee beans are the Robusto bean and the Arabica bean. And the Robusta bean has quite a bit more caffeine than Arabica, about twice as much caffeine as the Arabica bean.
Mm.
Uh, while a lot of people prefer the Arabica bean for its more subtle flavor. So I think there's also some differences in chlorogenic acid and other components. But I think the interesting thing about coffee and why it's relatively easy to study as compared with other dietary components is that the contrast in coffee intake are often quite big. So some people drinking like 5, 6 cups a day, other people drinking no coffee at all.
Mm.
So regardless of whether you drink Robusta bean coffee or Arabica bean coffee, the contrast in the components of coffee that you take in will still be very large for heavy coffee consumers compared to non-coffee consumers. So that makes it a little bit easier.
I see. So sort of the real variation is coming from consumption habits rather
Yeah,
than necessarily the beans. But
yeah.
we were just thinking about the history of this drink, and it's got me thinking about a few different avenues. Some of them quite specific, some of them quite broad. I'll start with the specific. My first question is, I'm picturing myself in Yemen in the 16th century. They can't have been roasting these beans the same way that people do now on an industrial scale to sort of very specific temperatures. I wonder if that affects the drink and its health effects. The
Yeah,
roast.
yeah, you're right. The roasting has a huge impact. So, for example, if you roast the coffee more, there will be less trigonelin and there will be more vitamin B3, niacin. Also, if you roast more, there will be less chlorogenic acid and there will be more kind of melanoids, other types of antioxidants that form during the roasting. So, the
Mm,
roasting actually has a very big impact on the components in coffee. And it's not so clear what is healthier. There's some proponents, as you may know, of green coffee beans as a supplements. So that is particularly high in chlorogenic acid because it hasn't undergone the whole roasting process.
mm.
But it's theoretically possible that some of the products of the roasting also have beneficial, for example, antioxidant effects.
Okay, so there's a change. We just can't necessarily say for better or worse at this point in
Correct.
time.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then returning to thinking about maybe the role that coffee has played in the history of thought and kind of engagement between different people. We've spoken a bit about the brain in terms of receptors, in terms of chronic disease risk. Has anyone thought about how coffee affects sort of the way you pay attention to things or one's mental faculties? Like does it not only change your ability to concentrate, but also the nature of how you associate different things? I mean, to use sort of a unscientific phrase, does it help you think more or less sort of quote unquote laterally? Does it change the way that your mind puts together ideas? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, but I think it'd be interesting to find out.
It's a good question. Yeah, for the review I recently wrote, I looked a bit on quite a bit into the literature. And what seemed to be apparent is that caffeine was most effective for kind of routine, boring tasks, like
Mm,
driving at night or being at a assembly belt, or rather than giving people more creative thoughts. Perhaps you need other substances for that. It's the most of the literature I saw was more on kind of routine task to stay concentrated despite its inherent boringness.
okay, interesting. I mean, you mentioned the military. I know that some militaries throughout the 20th century would give tank drivers amphetamines to keep them awake. Did any militaries experiment with caffeine and caffeine supplementation for pilots or tank drivers or whoever?
Yeah, that seems to be quite common. There's US government or reports from the military that have studied caffeine in quite a bit of detail, and they do advocate caffeine, uh, yeah, for these type of duties where people need to stay concentrated for a long time,
Mm.
sometimes in sleep-deprived states, which can be quite, yeah, quite common in, of course, combat missions.
I'm thinking about coffee and caffeine and physical performance. One thing I read which really shocked me was that actually until 2004, the International Olympic Committee included caffeine in its list of banned substances. And if athletes tested for a certain amount of caffeine in their presumably their blood, maybe it was metabolites in the urine, I don't know. They could be banned from events. So is caffeine sorry, is coffee an effective sort of performance enhancer? And does that vary between the kinds of performance you're trying to achieve, whether it be sort of more anaerobic performance or aerobic?
Hmm. Yeah, it does. It does seem to have some benefits for performance, and in relatively large amount, is my understanding. Larger amounts, at least, than are necessary to become more mentally alert, which only takes a cup of
Mm.
coffee or so. Um, and there's a couple of things I remember specifically. It reduces your sensitivity to pain related to performance. Um, but to be honest, I don't know really all the ins and outs of that. The effects of caffeine on performance. It's kind of like a different field that I haven't fully
Mm.
mastered.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, even just the effects on pain are interesting. I know that it can potentiate other kind of analgesics, but in the context of performance, that's I hadn't realized that coffee can help you fight through the pain of whatever you're doing. That's yeah, that's interesting. Um, on a related note, I mean, is coffee much of a? I know that coffee, I believe, has a diuretic effect, so you produce more
Hmm.
urine. Can it be significantly dehydrating?
Well, the thing
Can that
with
have a big
coffee is
effect?
that even the short term, if there's a short term effects on urine, increasing urine output, of course the coffee itself has a substantial amount of fluid. So
Mm.
the net effect will still be that you get more hydrated from coffee. And it seems that over time, if you have a habitual coffee consumption habit and you don't drink, you don't use very high amounts, so within this 400 milligrams that we've been talking about per day, that the effects on urine output is actually quite minimal. So
Mm.
it seems to be more for perhaps short-term effects in very high doses, but for normal doses in the long run, it seems to be quite minimal.
Okay. And in terms of GI health in general, we spoke a bit about the microbiome, but you know, coffee also has an effect of increasing the movement within your GI tract. Can too much coffee be bad for your GI health, or is there any research relating to that at all?
Well, I think uh, it does tend anecdotally one of the first things that people do if they have gastrointestinal symptoms to reduce their coffee intake. So it could be that the acid in coffee is, for example, a bit irritating to the stomach if people have stomach conditions. We were
Mm.
quite intrigued by that. So we did this trial of coffee consumption over half a year, and we looked at people drinking 4 cups of coffee or randomized to no coffee. So we did ask them a lot about their GI health, their stool, and things like that, and we didn't see any
Yeah,
impact
fun
over
stuff.
time. So although it's something that people talk about regularly, the evidence for it seems to be quite limited. So perhaps it's very personal, or perhaps at least it's something that's quite hard to systematically uh, find
Mm.
in research studies.
It's interesting. There seems to be, at least to my mind, a thread throughout a lot of coffee's effects on different systems in the body, in that you can think about mechanistic effects that it does have, which maybe would have negative effects on sort of some kind of function. But really, when you overlay that onto a healthy person's systems, it doesn't seem to cause any sort of serious systemic perturbation. Do you think that's sort of a fair blanket statement to make, or am I
Well,
overreaching
yeah,
there?
I think that's generally true. Yeah, it seems that, I mean, if there's one substance or commonly used beverage or even food that has been frequently studied in terms of negative health effects, it must be caffeine. It has been studied in
Mm,
relation to everything and suspected of all kinds of ill health effects, but very few things have been substantiated. I think some of the key things are the effects on pregnancy that may have some detrimental effects. There's an effect of sleep that's quite obvious, and there's an effect that's it seems that in some people who are quite sensitive to anxiety or
mm,
other mental disorders, it may have some effect on anxiety and nervousness, which is also dependent on the amount of caffeine and people's sensitivity. But other than that,
mm,
it seems to be very hard to find any conclusive detrimental health effect of caffeine.
mm. In the short term, the brain can kind of receive signals from the body about its state of activation, and get some cues about it, how it feels in terms of stress and
Hmm.
nervousness. Um, I wonder if there's any effects on long-term risks of psychiatric disorders or symptoms.
Well, the interesting thing is that so in experimental studies you sometimes see these effects, but if you look at like cross-sectional studies, it's not that coffee or caffeine intake is associated with anxiety. In some studies, it's the opposite, that people are anxious, drink less coffee. So again, it may be that people also modify their habits based on their experience and actually cut down on their caffeine or coffee consumption if they see these quite acute detrimental
These effects.
effects. Um,
Mm,
so in that sense, it's a bit hard to study in an epidemiological setting. There's some evidence that coffee intake, a regular coffee intake, may actually reduce the risk of depression and perhaps even suicide. So there's some evidence for detrimental short-term effects on anxiety, but on the other hand, there may be some benefits for depression.
wow, how interesting. You can certainly see how it's quite murky water navigating this literature. Like you said, it's such a thoroughly studied compound. You can probably find studies that suggest all sorts of different things. And I'm sure a big part of your job must just be using your intuition about the quality of study design to see what you think of their
No,
conclusions.
I agree, and I think some things stand out. So we talked a bit about Parkinson's disease. What is also quite strong is the effect of coffee on liver health. Um,
Mm,
so in terms of experimental studies in animals, cell studies, uh, looking at liver biomarkers, looking at liver cirrhosis, liver cancer, um, even some experimental studies looking at early stages of fibrosis. And in all these different study
see,
designs, there seems to be
sorry,
a
carry on.
benefit of coffee and caffeine on liver health. So I think in terms of the Parkinson's disease, the liver health, these are some areas where the research is quite conclusive from different angles. Whereas there's some other things like depression and Einstein that's already quite hard to study, and where the
Mm,
mechanistic evidence is also limited, that I would put much less confidence in.
sort of more the wild west of what we might understand.
Yeah, I mean, there may
Yeah.
be more conclusive studies over time, but I think you're right. It's important to distinguish a bit between what is quite seems quite solid and consistent, and what is more like an early area of exciting research.
Mm.
And then there's
You touched on one thing there that I think is. Oh, sorry to interrupt
no,
you.
I think you were
Um,
also talking about the caffeine in coffee, and that's something that's actually very solid and well confirmed in experimental randomized controlled trials. That if you have unfiltered coffee or the caffeine taken out of coffee administered to people in placebo-controlled trials, you do see very consistent impact on cholesterol. So that's also an example of aspects of coffee that are very well studied and confirmed.
just to clarify that for everyone listening, essentially there's a compound in coffee called caffeine, which if you filter the coffee, it doesn't end up in the drink. But if you don't filter it, obviously it's there, and people think that it plays a role in basically increasing the body's synthesis of de novo cholesterol, which sort of has some negative health effects on cardiovascular function. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
that's very well summarized. And of course, it's Yeah, so then the whole story about the type of coffee people consume is very important. So if you, for example, drink French press coffee or boiled coffee, then that can be relevant for your cholesterol levels. But if you drink filtered coffee or
Mm.
instant coffee, then the impact will be minimal or none. So that's
It's a shame that I find what they call Turkish coffee or Greek coffee probably the most delicious, because I think that's about as unfiltered as it can
no,
get.
these
So,
are the coffees where if you have problems with your cholesterol levels, it can actually make quite a difference to cut down on it, at least if you're a regular consumer. Um,
I mean, they put a lot of sugar in that as well. So,
yeah, if you put a lot of sugar and cream, it probably also doesn't help. Yeah, so these are some of the things that may be quite useful information for people with a high cholesterol levels. It's something that's relatively straightforward lifestyle choice, lifestyle change to switch the type of coffee you're drinking that may have an impact on your cholesterol levels. Of course, if it's like a
mm,
once a week or once a month treat, it will not matter much what type of
it's
coffee you
not too big a
drink.
problem. Mm-mm. One other thing you mentioned with respect to liver and liver function was
Hmm.
fibrosis, and I suspect we're now coming to a really interesting frontier in our understanding of coffee and its effects. Um, I know that anecdotally, some people are interested in putting coffee grounds in breaks in the skin and seeing whether that causes it to heal faster. I don't know about the quality of that sort of work, but regenerative medicine as a whole is so hot at the moment. How strong might the anti-fibrotic effects of coffee, either on the liver or other parts of the body, be? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that seems to be quite solid. So if you do cell studies, there seems to be an effect of in terms of the reducing the collagen deposition in liver cells.
Mm,
There's even a randomized controlled trial in patients with hepatitis C, where caffeinated coffee reduced liver collagen levels. And if you look at markers of liver function, there's always a very strong association in whatever population I've seen the study being done in. And then all the way from fibrosis as an endpoint to cirrhosis and liver cancer, they're very consistent and strong inverse associations. So yeah, I've been quite struck by the potential effect of coffee and caffeine on liver health. And the interesting thing is that there's also some evidence for an impact of coffee consumption on liver insulin sensitivity, which could again give a link to type 2 diabetes. So it may be that liver is
mm.
quite a central organ when it comes to the potential health benefits of coffee.
And my understanding of the liver and glucose metabolism stuff is that it's particularly to do with fructose, which is quite interesting considering how much fructose is in high fructose corn syrup, for example, and how big a role that plays in our
Well,
diet.
that's true. I mean, one simple benefit you will have is if you don't drink soft drinks, but you drink coffee instead, it reduces your fructose intake. But I think, yeah, that has been used as a model to induce uh, liver insulin resistance, and that was partly then kind of alleviated by using coffee, whether decaffeinated coffee or caffeinated coffee, actually. So
Mm,
it's part of like a whole set of studies that's kind of converging on the benefit for liver function. So that gives some more confidence that that's a really promising area for further research and potentially some real
mm,
clinical benefit for the prevention of some liver disorders.
mm. My instinct with the anti-fibrotic effect is that antioxidants might be playing a role. Do you have any sort of intuition about what might be going on?
I think that's true. Yeah, that well, it could be the caffeine itself because adenosine can play a role
Mm.
in tissue remodeling and
Ah.
collagen production. So the the effect of caffeine on blocking adenosine receptors could play a role. But you're right, it may also be polyphenols and antioxidant effects that relieve oxidative stress and reduce fibrosis in that way. So it could well be a combination of different components of coffee having some synergistic beneficial effect.
Fantastic. I think that's about everything I wanted to discuss, and I'm also aware that it's coming close to 11 o'clock in the evening your time. So I'll wrap up with just sort of one more question, if that's all
Sure.
right with you. Um, well, two. I'm going to sneak another one in. The first one is: As a result of kind of this area of research and thinking about this, have your daily habits or your relationship with caffeinated drinks and coffee, has that relationship changed?
Well, the one thing I was looking on a little bit is the amount of caffeine in espresso, and although it's much less than in French press coffee or boiled coffee, there's still some caffeine in coffee. And because I drink a lot of espresso every day, I did think about moving back to some drip filtered coffee. So that's one of the things it may have impacted on my own life. Yeah,
Espresso just tastes too good, though.
it's hard to resist. I agree.
Yeah. And the final question is, obviously you're interested in lots of aspects of nutrition. Going forward, perhaps outside of thinking about the effects of coffee, what else would you like to look at in the future, or are you currently looking at?
So I think this research on coffee also had made me think more holistically about other aspects of the diet. For example, coffee is basically like a plant food. And you could think about other plant foods like specific foods, for example, and how specific foods can have a different effect on perhaps risk of diabetes. So we have done
Mm,
some research on flavonoids in different foods, and it seems that apples and berries, particularly blueberries, are much more associated with the lower risk of diabetes than other types of foods, particularly foods like bananas. So it just had
mm,
made me think a bit more carefully about what different plant foods could have for benefit in terms of beneficial effects and the type of pathways that could be involved. So I think there's a lot to
mm.
explore in nutrition beyond just thinking about either macronutrients or very broad food groups like fruits and vegetables that are wildly different in the type of phytochemicals, vitamin minerals, and other compounds like
Micronutrients.
polyphenols that they contain. So the health effects could be quite different. So I think a lot more in-depth study is needed to fully get to the true story about what impact nutrition could have on health.
Well, that all sounds equally fascinating, and I hope we get an opportunity to speak about that at a point in the future. Let me just say thank you very much for coming on again.
Thanks so much, Stan. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Pager podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then head to Spotify or iTunes to hear more.
As ever, we'd love to hear what you think, and you can reach us via our Facebook page or by email. See you next time.